Every now and then, I'll find myself having a conversation with a guy that's a bit different than my usual routine because every now and then a guy comes to me because he's trying to decide whether or not he should keep going in his marriage. Oftentimes, what's happening is that he's stuck in this dilemma between, I really want to save my marriage. I love my wife, and yet she's doing this thing, she's exhibiting this behavior that I really can't tolerate anymore. And maybe even there's some particular harms that are coming to me that are happening to me or happening to my kids or happening to our shared finances because of how sort of stuck she is in this behavior. And so I think I'm going to have to file for a divorce. But Stephen, I'm not ready to do that. I don't want to do that. What do I do? Well, many times what I end up doing in those conversations is trying to help that man find that third path that lets you say yes to the marriage and stay committed on that front, but say no to the behavior and even draw some boundaries around that. Now, in this episode, we are following up on the one that we did last time. In the last episode, we sort of looked at the standard advice around boundaries and tried to understand why boundaries seem to be both difficult to use properly and especially difficult to use in a way that actually protects and uplifts your marriage. We talked about how boundaries tend to point you away from your marriage, and my argument is that's in some sense because of the way that they're taught. We laid out a few different specific issues. A few of those were boundaries tend to be taught in a way where they're triggered by hurt feelings, which is both deceptive and subjective. And particularly, the most dangerous part of that is that if you're talking to two people who are in a difficult marriage, there are difficult dynamics that they haven't been able to get through yet. Well, you're pretty much saying to both of those people you need boundaries because they're going to have hurt feelings. And that's not always the case. At least that's what I'm going to argue today. Another issue is that we talked about how limit plus consequences, if that's your framework, if you're thinking, here's my limit, and then here's the consequences that are going to happen when that limit is broken, guess what? You are now looking at your spouse's experience to determine what sort of boundary, what the substance of your boundary should be. And this is problematic because, as we know, we talk about all the time here on Husband Help Haven, you can't control your spouse. And so we need to do boundaries in a way that is built off of what we can control. Another problem is that a lot of time you're told how to set the boundaries, but it's not so clear how to lift the boundaries. And what this ends up with is that you have boundaries as a tool in relationships so much of the time taught in a way, intentionally or otherwise, where as soon as you start taking the boundary on, you're also taking on divorce. You're taking on, I'm looking away from the marriage now. I'm hedging away from the marriage. My boundary is a step towards divorce, not a step towards protecting and uplifting the marriage. Now, what I'm going to argue in this episode is that there is a way to do boundaries and have it help your marriage and to stay committed to your marriage, even as you have maybe sometimes even very strong boundaries. Now, how are we going to do that? We're going to get into that in just a moment. I want to say at the outset, I'm just one guy here. I am trying, like everybody else who's talked about boundaries, I'm trying to do it in a way that honors the people I want to help. And for me, that's every married person. I like marriage. I think marriage is good. And I want there to be more happy marriages in the world. The way I particularly am going about doing that is by helping men be better husbands. That's what the Husband Help podcast is all about, helping you become the best husband you can be no matter what your marriage is like right now. But honestly, boundaries is something I've always struggled with. Part of it, I think, is because the way that it's taught is vague. And it's like, if you're a conflict avoidant person and you're left with subjective guidance about how to use boundaries, and you're also a marriage committed person, and all you're left with is divorce leaning advice about boundaries, well, you end up with this place like, I don't know how to use this tool. But what I'm going to share in this episode is an approach to boundaries that I've more clearly developed for myself over the past couple of years. I've started to teach it more and more in Husband Help group. There's been really good feedback from it. For me, this approach to boundaries makes sense. It makes it more objective. It's possible that I'll refine this over time, but basically, I just want to share in this episode how I'm thinking about boundaries currently. And I'm hoping that for you, it feels like the unlock that it has felt for me. Now, without further ado, how do we actually go about setting boundaries? And I will just really briefly say, if you want the cheat sheet, if you want a reference sheet for this, no email required, just literally a PDF you can download and look back on. husbandhelphaven.com/episode 39, episode dash 39. Link in the description. You can go find that if you want. Now, the right way to set boundaries in a marriage, to me, is going to revolve around two words. Those two words are conditional and protective. What do these words mean? Well, it means, in short, that we want boundaries that are conditional rather than unconditional. In other words, we want to be able to point to a specific thing that is causing us to have this boundary, a specific behavior, a specific pattern, a specific thing. We're going to talk more about what that thing ought to be and how you qualify that thing, but we need a condition, a clear condition under which we are instituting a boundary. Secondly, we want boundaries that are protective, not punitive. And this goes back to one of the things we talked about at the start. We want boundaries that are about just protecting yourself. That's really the full purpose of a boundary, is protection. So if we think about boundaries in this way, conditional and protective, right off the bat, I think that we are starting to hedge against some of the problems with how boundaries are taught that I mentioned at the start of the episode. Because you're now forced to think a little bit more honestly, with a little bit more introspection about both the condition and the protection of your boundary. The condition, you can think of that like the trigger. The protection is the substance. It's the thing that you're going to do, that you're going to draw that line around. If we're thinking about, let's just unpack both of these terms a little bit more. Condition, you think about what is that repeated disregard for safety? And I do think that needs to be the threshold for which we draw a boundary around. Again, boundaries are not the tool that we should be using every day. They shouldn't be your daily driver, everyday carry sort of tool in your marriage. They come out for those more extreme situations. Now, again, that's not to say most marriages shouldn't need boundaries. I could see boundaries being a thing in most marriages. I think everybody needs to have this skill. And ironically enough, just as an aside, I think that what you're going to hear from this episode is actually not that you should keep boundaries further along, but actually that a lot of people would do better if they set smaller boundaries earlier. Okay? And we'll talk more about that as we go. But the simplest way to think about this condition is you're trying to ask yourself, what is the simplest way to describe the unsafe pattern that I'm experiencing here? And we need to remember that truth is important in the relationship, and truth neither minimizes nor exaggerates. Men are tempted different ways on this, but what we want to be able to say is just honestly, when you do that thing or say that thing, it causes me this particular hurt. We're framing this against a behavior, not against the person. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, okay, that sounds like, Stephen, maybe there is still a little bit of subjective wiggle room. Pause, just wait. You'll see that the way that we actually apply these boundaries forces it to where there's no way to get to enforcing a boundary without making sure that what you're seeing is actually reckless or some form of disregard for safety. And I do think, let me just say again, disregard for safety, that does need to be the condition under all of our boundaries. Now, disregard for safety can be intentional. It can be reckless. It can be unintentional, just you're not thinking carefully. It can also be compulsive. Addiction comes to mind. Your spouse is dealing with addiction. They can't really help their unsafe behavior in some sense of the word. And yet you might still need a boundary. That is a compulsive disregard for safety in that person. And so again, safety is an important word that you're going to hear over and over again because we come to that second word. Protection is the other pillar of our boundaries. We want boundaries that are protective, not punitive. And there are two really important questions that I'm going to encourage you to think about that are this skeleton of how we actually enforce these boundaries here in just a moment. I'm going to walk you through the sort of order of operations. The two questions are, first, what is the smallest thing they could do to restore my belief in their regard for my safety? Question number two is, okay, if they don't do that, what is the smallest step I can take that sufficiently protects me from further harm? So remember those two questions. What's the smallest thing they could do to restore trust? And if they won't do that, what's the smallest thing you will do to enforce safety? Okay? Now, hold on to those two questions. We're going to get to those in just a moment because the way that you apply boundaries is built off of those two questions. Now, how do we actually enforce the boundary? Here's how we do it. Step one, you express hurt and you seek buy-in. That's it. And I think that a lot of times this step is skipped or it's not done in a good faith way. But it's very important that we do this in a good faith way. We are assuming that pattern of disregard for your safety is in that unintentional category. Our good faith assumption, our benefit of the doubt assumption, is that if our spouse knew and understood how harmful their actions were towards us, that they would modify their behavior or mitigate their behavior or at least pay attention to their behavior, whatever the case may be. This is the step where we are looking for buy-in. We want them to care about us being hurt, and that care to be enough to get them to change their behavior. That is our first step. And I encourage you to start here, even if you think you've already done this. When it comes time to enforce the boundary, you're ready to do this in the moment. Start with the good faith bid for buy-in. That means express the hurt, look for buy-in. When I say express the hurt, I am going to encourage you. Speak in something of an emotional way. Have some sort of emotional language. Say, when you do this thing, it really hurts me. It causes me to feel unsafe in this particular way. I am worried about this particular thing. Here's my specific fear or this specific lack of faith that your actions are causing in me. Whatever it is, we just express that thing in good faith with hopes that they will hear it and adjust. But they don't do that. What happens next? Now we fall down to the next step, the boundary of insistence. Now, do you remember when I said, what is the thing they could do to restore trust? What's that smallest step they could take? Well, that is the thing that we're insisting on with the boundary of insistence. This is the thing that now that they've rejected, they say, okay, you can't have my buy-in. Now we're falling down to, okay, if we can't get buy-in, we're going to look at compliance. Here's the thing that if you comply with this, it will at least put me at ease. It will at least restore my sense of safety. So here's what I need you to do. Let me give you some examples. It might be, look, I need you to acknowledge that thing you just said was hurtful. I need you to lower the tone and volume of your voice for us to continue this conversation. I have to insist that we get a third party involved. We either need to talk to a marriage counselor or some sort of specialist about this thing. I insist that you not text your affair partner when we're in the same room together. Okay, each of these are, again, we're granting that we're seeking something that's not in your control. We are looking over at her side of the fence, so to speak, and saying, look, here's what you need to do to get your side of the fence in order to where it's safe for us to proceed together. So we're granting that this is not under your control, which is why it's not the end of our boundary process. Because if that thing that you're insisting on is refused, then what we can do, we don't have to do, and I'll give you some examples where you might not do this, but the next step in the intensity of our boundary is a boundary of refusal. Okay? So we started with express the hurt and seek buy-in. Okay, we're not getting the buy-in, so what happens next? We go to boundary of insistence. That is refused. What do? Now we go to what we can control, boundary of refusal. This is where you say, very well, if you will not do the thing that I'm asking you to do to restore trust, then here's the thing that I'm going to refuse to do to ensure my safety. Again, this is going to be different depending on the circumstances, depending on the specific thing that you're drawing the boundary around. It might be that you say, I insist that you lower your voice. You refuse to do that. You're ramping up. You got even louder when I asked you to do that. Okay, I refuse to be in this room with you. You might have a similar boundary around texting the affair partner. You say, okay, you tell me, look, they're just a friend. We're not even together anyways. We're already separated. And you refuse to do that. You claim entitlement to being able to text whoever you want, wherever you want in our home. Very well. Even at the cost of normalcy, I cannot sit in any situation where I fear you could take your phone out and start texting. So that's probably going to mean no dinner tables, no just sitting together watching Netflix, not all these sort of normal things. I can't do. Now, this is a good time to draw out a little side note because what you might have in a situation like that, let's just play that out a little bit. You tell your wife who's having an emotional affair, you say, look, I insist that you stop texting your affair partner. She says, no, I won't do that. How dare you even try to tell me that? You say, okay, well, look, I know that we've been doing this pretend everything's normal thing with our kids and nobody really knows what's going on. I'm not trying to rock the boat, but please hear me. I cannot be around you when you're texting your affair partner, so I therefore can't be in the same room with you. Okay. She says to that, I don't care. Fine. Do what you want to do. In fact, I'll be happy about that. I'll enjoy the extra space. Now, if our framework for boundaries were driven by consequences, we would look at that and we would say, uh-oh, I don't have a good enough boundary. The consequences are not proportional for her to the hurt that I'm experiencing, to the level of threat I experience from her doing that. And by the way, just as a side note, if you're listening to this and you're thinking that threat is an extreme word for what happens when you are observing your spouse communicate with an affair partner, you haven't lived through that. It is a threat. It is extremely painful. Um, she might say to that, I don't care. If our framework for boundaries was driven by consequences, we would say, okay, well, our boundary's not good enough. But remember, the boundary word is not consequences, it's protection. In fact, we are pointedly not doing punitive boundaries. We're just doing protection boundaries. So here's what you ask yourself. You say, she doesn't care. Okay, am I still protected even if she doesn't care? Yes, I am. As long as I don't have to see her doing that stuff, I'm protected. So she can care or not care. My boundary is not affected by that. The success of my boundary is not affected by that. The enforcement of my boundary is not affected by that. It just is what it is. And again, now we come to, let's keep this going. What would be the right way to lift boundaries? The most important part is that we want to. All right. And I think that's, again, just another thing that's often missed is that the whole reason that we have conditional boundaries is so that we can very clearly point at the reason that the boundaries are there and also the thing that would get the boundaries to go away. Because remember, we said every condition that triggers a boundary should be able to be articulated in some way as disregard for safety. Okay? So every boundary traces back to disregard for safety. So the simple fact of the matter is the thing that lifts every boundary is regard for safety. Now, again, I want to be very clear. Regard for safety just has to come in the form of compliance. At least that would be my contention. Compliance is sufficient. We can get to buy-in later. We can always reinforce the boundary if that compliance wanes. But a boundary is successful if it generates compliance. It doesn't have to generate buy-in. So again, once they've done the thing, they've done the boundary of insistence. Well, what we say to that is, thank you. We acknowledge that they have done the thing that we've been insisting them to do, and we do it in a humble way, and we do it in a way that's understanding that it doesn't feel good. Even when it's deserved, it still doesn't feel good to have a boundary set on you. And so if we're able to, we could ideally even do something that's a little bit reconnecting. We say, thank you. I just want to re-say, I'm committed to this marriage. I don't like having that boundary. Please know that boundary was not against you. And we can even say this, if it's true, we can say, and now that I feel safe again, we can talk more about whether that boundary was even appropriate or if there's a different way I should do that next time. I'm open to feedback. Now that safety's been restored, now that you've met that boundary of insistence for me, I'm open-handed, open-armed. Again, we're trying to acknowledge and thank them for their compliance. We're trying to restate commitment to the marriage. And we're going to presume now that we can continue life together, whatever normal looks like in the crisis or in the situation that you're in currently. We're going back to that status quo. And then again, maybe you heard me say this, but I just want to say it really clearly. Don't try and immediately transform their compliance into buy-in. Just take the condition being met. Let the compliance be good enough for now. We can get to buy-in later. Remember, every time that you need this boundary, you're going to go through this process of express the hurt and seek buy-in. So every journey down to a boundary of refusal, the one where you say, okay, this is my or else, is going to involve a clear expression of, hey, that thing you're doing feels like disregard to safety to me. Help. Okay, they don't help. Okay, then you have to do this to restore my sense of safety. Okay, you don't do that. All right, well, then here's what I'm not doing, right? So there's this very clear facing towards the marriage progression. And I hope that you hear that through all of this. Love unites this entire approach. It can be done with humility. It can be done with love. And this is going to be where I want to segue to how boundaries serve your marriage. Because I think that when we understand that boundaries are for protection only, they're not for trying to get your spouse to change permanently. We need them to stop that thing they're doing that's not safe. A helpful way to frame out, like, when do you need boundaries? Or another pair of words that I like is standards and boundaries. You can think back, we had that episode a while back called This One Word is Poisoning Your Marriage, and that one word is should. And basically, this is when you confuse your standards for your boundaries. Now, your standards are the good way that you want things to be in your marriage. Your boundaries are the bad way that you won't tolerate them to be in your marriage. Okay? So your standards is the bar that you try to meet. Your boundaries are the line you won't cross. All right? Now, there is a gray area middle between your standards and your boundaries. I think a lot of times where people get into trouble is they're trying to get up to their standards and they use the tool of boundaries. That's not what we need. If you are below your standards in your relationship, most of the time, I'm going to say that you usually are going to need just those first two steps of the boundary setting process. Now, I said I was going to talk about a situation where you might have a boundary of insistence that doesn't become a boundary of refusal. What might that look like? An example that sort of fits in here would be stonewalling. If your spouse is stonewalling you, there's a particular conversation that you have been trying to have with them and they just won't have it with you. They just shut down. They might even walk away. You can say, look, I really want to finish this conversation. Express the hurt. But then from there, we might just go down to boundary of insistence. Look, I'm going to have to insist that we finish this conversation. Okay, they stonewall again, they walk away. Well, we don't have to have a boundary of refusal around that necessarily. We might just be when they come back from their stonewalling, they try to go just sweep it under the rug, pretend like normal. We just restake down that boundary of insistence. Oh, hold on. Remember, there was that conversation that we need to finish. Can we do that right now? And then they say no, they walk off again. Or maybe they said, oh, I really don't want to. Can we do it later? Can we do it this time? You might say, and again, this is where there's some discretion. You might say, yeah, sure, that's fine. And then you still continue to say, okay, well, but remember, that boundary of insistence is still active, okay? Again, really, boundaries of refusal hopefully are a rarely used tool for most couples. Some couples need them more often. Those couples who have one or the other who tends to get a little bit aggressive, you might need those boundaries a little bit more often. Now, one final asterisk, although I think the principles can still work in more extreme situations, I will say also, if you are suffering from physical abuse, you're suffering from some really dangerous situation, please don't make this podcast episode like your one lone hope. And a really well thought out system for boundaries might not be enough. You might need to get some third party help. You might need to get yourself safe in a more substantial way. But as I said, boundaries really can serve your marriage in three ways. First off, they're guardrails for marriage contentment. I said at the start of the episode that most people who end up using boundaries in the wrong way would have done a lot better if they just used boundaries earlier and lighter, like use smaller boundaries earlier in their relationship. They could get to this point where there's not so much hurt, there's not so much discontent that's built up through the frustration of this thing not changing, that if we had just been more active against it earlier, that would help. And so again, when we understand boundaries in a good way, we have a way of protecting our marital satisfaction. We have some guardrails. We set some lines around, here's the stuff that's tolerable. We actually do have lines at the outer edges of our relationship for where like behavior becomes intolerable. Yeah, if you push all the way out there, like, sorry, no. Okay, so we have some guardrails. This ends up also helping the spouse who's doing the thing that's unsafe, which to be clear, that might be both husband and wife over different issues or in different times or at different seasons. Okay, we have that the spouse who's on the receiving end of the boundary is served because not only does the boundary itself have a teaching effect, which I said, again, the teaching is not the goal of the boundary, but it is a secondary effect. It's a symptom of the boundary. Okay, there is a feedback mechanism there. They learn from it. Also, though, it serves them in a more direct way because it prevents the accrual of guilt. Okay, so let's go with the spouse who is very angry. Okay, and when they escalate, they start to yell, they start to cuss, they start to say things that they wouldn't ever say, and maybe even would be like ashamed to have said when they're thinking clearly, when they're calm. Well, if you draw a boundary around that behavior, you are serving them because the next morning or the next day or whenever they snap out of their rage, they don't have as big a pile of craters behind them, verbal craters that they've left, that they're now looking back on just with guilt and shame and everything else. So again, just having that boundary serves them. But of course, it also serves you because you're keeping yourself safe. But even beyond that, I find a lot of times, especially in those relationships where there is one aggressor spouse and there is a more passive spouse, a lot of times that passive spouse really isn't very good at expression. Well, even doing boundaries my way, you do have to be able to express yourself. In fact, that's the first step of the process. And so doing boundaries in this way forces you, trains you to express yourself in your relationship. It builds boldness on that front. And so the boundary helps you in that way too. So guys, let me just recap this very briefly. Again, go get the cheat sheet. If you want to look at this visually, I will have it laid out in a singular sheet where you can run through it and just review and look back on it. We have conditional and protective. Those are the two pillars of our boundaries. Conditional says, what is the specific hurtful thing you're doing? Protection says, what are the two things, either the thing you could do or the thing I will do that keep me safe? How do I keep myself safe from that harmful condition? Okay? And then the way that we enforce those boundaries is first we express the hurt and we seek buy-in because we know the boundary doesn't accomplish buy-in. It just accomplishes compliance. So once we do that, then we go to boundary of insistence. We say, no, look, seriously, I was trying to get you on board here. I insist that you do this to restore my felt safety. And then if that's refused, then we go to the boundary of refusal. And then once that's met, we lift the boundary and we say, well done. I'm still committed to this marriage. I want things to work. Let's go. For most people, this is an approach to boundaries that has really made a lot of sense to me, that has helped me understand better how to teach boundaries, and for my clients has helped them enforce and understand and use boundaries in a more faithful and integrity-driven way that allows you to stay committed to your marriage and yet also committed to keeping yourself safe, which is important and good. So that's the goal. That's what boundaries should be able to do. They should let you say no to the behavior, but still say yes to the marriage. And I think that this framework for boundaries does that. Please, if you have thoughts, let me know. Like I said, I'm not going to claim that I'm sitting here on the top of the mountain, that this is just the perfect way, the only way to do it. I think this way makes sense. I think this way corrects a lot of the problems with how boundaries are taught normally. If you have further thoughts, if you think I could clarify something a little better, let me know. I love getting feedback like that. With that, guys, we will go ahead and close it down for this episode. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that this helped you. I hope this gave you some stuff to think about, a new way to see your options inside your marriage. And either way, thank you for being somebody who cares about your marriage, who's committed to your marriage, and who's trying to figure out how to do right by your marriage. So best of luck in that as you endeavor to do that. I am eager to continue helping you however I may, especially to my men. And so with that, I will go ahead and sign off. It's been Steven coming at you with much manly love. We'll see you on the next one.